and welcome to another episode of Pensions Unpacked. I'm Becky O'Connor, Head of Pensions and Savings at Interactive Investor, and I'm joined again by James Jones-Tinsley of Barnett Waddingham to discuss all the things that you want to know about pensions but were too afraid to ask. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking there wasn't very much left for the Chancellor to announce by way of changes to taxation and pensions. We've had the Health and Social Care Levy in recent weeks, adding to the tax burden, and of course previously frozen allowances. But there's always room for more, and the government is still looking for revenue to pay for the pandemic. So now seems like a good time actually to look at pensions and the way pensions are taxed. I want to talk specifically about allowances today, focusing first on the lifetime allowance. And perhaps, James, if we could just sort of go into what it is, first of all. What is the lifetime allowance? Why is it there?
Okay, well, the lifetime allowance was one of the allowances that was brought in on the 6th of April 2006, which is a key date in pensions history and more commonly referred to as A-Day. And really, the best way to look at the lifetime allowance is it's a ceiling on tax-efficient pension savings. So initially, when they were first looking at A-Day, going way back to 2002, they were calling it the lifetime limit. And I do remember hearing a politician saying along the way, well, if we change limit to allowance, it sounds better, it sounds more welcoming. Limit sounds very sort of, full stop, but an allowance sounds kinder. So that's why it was changed to lifetime allowance for the A-Day legislation. And initially, the actual amounts of the lifetime allowance were very, very generous. It started off at £1.5 million, which I would say for most of the population was a ceiling that was right up there, that they'd never ever get anywhere near. So they didn't have to worry about breaching it, because if you do breach the lifetime allowance, there is then a tax charge on the excess, and the amount of the tax charge depends upon how you actually take the excess. So if you take it as a lump sum, the tax charge is 55%, which is obviously a very sizable amount. If you took it as pension income, that excess tax charge goes down to 25%, but then don't forget, most people will be paying income tax on their pension income as well. And the idea was that the two would broadly be the same, regardless of how you took the excess. I think in those early days it was good because they actually proposed or projected what the lifetime allowance would be over the first 5 tax years following A-Day, and it would gradually rise from 1.5 million to 1.8 million. And then we were promised it would continue to increase after that every tax year. So from a planning perspective, it was brilliant because financial advisors could sort of take a 5-year view with regards to pension contributions. And I know we'll come on to the annual allowance soon, so I won't steal all the thunder on that just at the moment. But then, of course, we had the financial crisis towards the end of the last decade, and the pension lifetime allowance was frozen at 1.8 million. And then, with the coalition government coming in from 2010, the great cut in the lifetime allowance began, and by 2016 it had fallen to £1 million. And it has started increasing from 2017 by CPI, but then, as you've already mentioned, Becky, in the budget this year, the current level was frozen, proposedly for 5 further tax years. So it's had a very rocky ride, and I think the problem is now more and more people are breaching the lifetime allowance, and in some respects it's looked on almost as a tax on successful investment performance, which really was never ever the intention of it. It was there to replicate a pension from, say, the civil service pension scheme, and that's never been addressed, and there is definitely an unlevel playing field between defined contribution pensions and defined benefit pensions when it comes to the lifetime allowance, very much in favour of the DB side.
Absolutely. So on paper, £1 million sounds like a huge amount of money, but of course, if you then convert that into retirement income, and assuming that a pension may have been built up for a couple rather than an individual through one pension pot, it may not actually go as far as you would think.
No, and I think if you certainly in the open market, if you were to take that £1 million and buy a inflation-proofed annuity with a surviving spouse's pension of, let's say, at least half of the main annuitant's pension, you're probably looking literally at a few £1,000s a year, because annuity rates are so low, because gilt yields are so low, and that situation has prevailed for many years now. And what does sound like a fantastic amount of money when you see, although you're getting a known income for the rest of your life, and I think that's a very crucial and very important point, and for some people that will be the right answer. The size of annuity rates just means that the actual amount you're getting in your hand is probably nowhere near what you were expecting.
Mm. And can we talk a little bit about how the lifetime allowance is tested? So once you start drawing from your pension and it's tested against the lifetime allowance, there's a couple of tests, isn't there, that people need to be aware of if this applies to them?
Yes. Well, I'm going to throw a bit of jargon on the table, if I may, because whenever you go through what's known as a benefit crystallisation event, or a BCE, your pension funds at the point of that BCE are tested against your lifetime allowance. And I think we're going to move on to look at protection, so I won't go into too much detail now. For most people, it will be the prevailing lifetime allowance at the moment, or when they take the benefits. So there is a test then, and basically their pension fund, the fund or funds that they are crystallising, what do I mean by that, turning into pounds and pence, are measured against the prevailing lifetime allowance. If the fund value is lower, then yes, it's going to be using up a percentage of that individual's lifetime allowance, but there will be no excess tax charge. If, however, it's above their lifetime allowance, then as we said before, there will be an excess tax charge levied. The other key test then comes when they attain age 75, and the actual BCE test that will be applied very much depends on what they've done to date with their pension fund. It may be they've not touched it at all, it remains uncrystallised, to use another bit of jargon, or it may be they've fully crystallised their pension into, say, drawdown, or they may have a bit of both, and that will then dictate the tests that are applied at 75. And again, if there is an excess against the prevailing lifetime allowance at that point, then a tax charge would arise.
So does what you do with your pension pot between the first crystallisation event and the second at age 75 make a difference to the amount of tax that you could end up paying in practice?
Yes, in simple terms, and there are ways of utilising your pension fund, certainly leading up to 75, in such a way to try and reduce or hopefully avoid an excess tax charge at 75. So it's very much down to each individual circumstances. I think the crucial one is that if you go into drawdown, let's say at 60, you have that first test at that point, so you've used up so much of your lifetime allowance at that point, and then you don't draw any money at all. When you get to 75, what's actually tested then is investment growth in your drawdown fund between first opening it, say at 60, and then having it tested at 75. So if you've had a really good investment experience over that 15-year period, you could face quite a serious excess tax charge at 75. So although it's not right for everybody, I think it's definitely worth considering drawing money from your drawdown pot once you've gone into drawdown, because in a way that's the idea behind going into drawdown, is you start taking an income even though you have complete control over how much income you take from one year to the next, which can also be tax advantageous.
Definitely something to be aware of and requires some thought and planning, doesn't it? So we will talk about protections of the lifetime allowance, but there is another allowance that people need to be aware of, is there not, as they're building their pension pot? Well, a couple of others actually, but starting with one as affecting people perhaps earlier in their pension accumulation journey, is the annual allowance. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the background of the annual allowance, why it's needed, why the government thinks it's needed, and what happens.
Okay, well, the annual allowance was introduced at A Day along with the lifetime allowance, and the idea is that this sets a cap or a ceiling on the maximum amount that you can contribute tax efficiently to your pension in every tax year. Now, again, as with the lifetime allowance, it was great at A Day because we were given the annual allowance figures for the first 5 tax years following A Day, and these seem very halcyon days, but it started off at £215,000 gross per individual in 2006, and the idea was it would go up to £255,000 by the 2010-11 tax year. So over £250,000 effectively could go into a pension, which now, for reasons I'll explain in a couple of minutes, seem somewhat unbelievable. But so thinking of that and then setting that against the lifetime allowance, you can see that if you were able to make significant contributions over a number of years, you could certainly start getting nearer to the lifetime allowance. But again, because of the financial crisis from around 2007-8, we had the coalition government come in 2010. Just as with the lifetime allowance, they also reduced the annual allowance, and it was the first reduction was a serious one because it went right down from 255,000 a tax year to £50,000 per tax year, and that was then subsequently cut a few years later down to £40,000 gross per tax year. So you can see how the ability to contribute to a pension, and it's not just your own personal contributions, you've got to include in there any employer contributions and even any third-party contributions in getting to that £40,000 amount. The story didn't stop there. I mean, really, and I can understand why people's anxieties about tax changes were coming through in your Great British Retirement Survey, because we also then had in 2015, when the pension freedoms came in, the concept of a money purchase annual allowance. That started off at £10,000 for those people who had flexibly accessed their pension, their defined contribution pension. That was then subsequently cut again in 2017 to £4,000. So literally a tenth of the normal annual allowance. And then I think the government must have thought we still wanted lots more changes. So in 2016, they came along with the concept of the tapered annual allowance, whereby if you were earning a certain amount of money a year, you would gradually have your annual allowance tapered down to as low as £10,000 a year. So from what started off as pension simplification in 2006, I think it's fair to say now it's pension complification, where we have theoretically 3, or even if you want to include the alternative allowance as well, 4 different types of annual allowance. So again, you need help, you need a planning assistance, to make sure you don't breach your annual allowance, because there are tax charges levied if you do so as well.
So there is something called carry forward as well, isn't there, which is worth knowing about if you are concerned about the annual allowance. How does that work?
Well, that was something that carry forward existed as a concept back in the pre-A Day era, and there was also carry back as well. They disappeared at A Day, but then carry forward came back again in 2011 when the annual allowance was slashed from 255,000 to 50,000. And the idea of this was that as long as you are in a pension scheme and have been for the last 3 tax years, before the tax year that you're making your contributions, you can actually go back up to 3 tax years once you've maxed out in the current tax year and carry forward any unused pension contributions from those previous 3 tax years. And you into the current tax year, you need to have sufficient earnings to cover the whole amount, but it can be a very, very useful and efficient planning tool and a great way of mopping up unused contributions if you are in a position to do so in a particular tax year. The fun finishes, though, once you flexibly access your DC pension and you become subject to the money purchase annual allowance, because one of the consequences of that, as well as the much lower allowance allowed, is that you lose any ability to carry forward as well.
So the money purchase annual allowance, the purpose of that, correct me if I'm wrong, was to prevent people recycling money and continuing to attract tax relief on large sums, right? Recycling, putting more money back into their pension, basically.
But it was also as well to stop employers paying people their salary through their pension and allowing them to actually take that salary in a far more tax efficient way as, say, tax-free cash and pension income than receiving the salary directly, and obviously it's incurring both employer, well, certainly employer and employee NI as well along the way, and of course income tax.
But it has also become controversial, hasn't it? Because there's now so much time until somebody receives their state pension between that and when they first maybe start accessing their own pension, and they may have a decade of work where they're limited in the amount that they can put back in their pension, potentially quite substantially.
Yes, I think that's the thing, and certainly in the consultation paper, which talked about reducing it from 10,000 to 4,000, we at Barnett Waddingham, we did a response to that, and we largely were against the reduction, and one of the main reasons why was the very reason you've just said, that people, I mean, the problem is people might trigger, they may be in a situation where they trigger the pension fund at 55 because they have a genuine financial need to do so, completely unaware that they've triggered the MPAA, and then find themselves in a better position where they can start contributing more significant sums again to build that pot back up before they formally retire, and then suddenly find themselves levied with tax charges and potential other penalties for not telling other providers they've triggered the MPAA. So there's that sort of unknown aspect of it, which is a real unintended consequence. But as you quite rightly say, it stops people from then finding themselves in a better position and I've got the wherewithal now to start making significant contributions again. I can't because I'm subject to this very low bar of 4,000 a year. The problem is, I don't think that statistics are actually kept at the moment of how many people have breached the MPAA, which certainly would help, just get an idea of the quantum of any problem. But I think if you think about it, assuming that people's salaries are gradually going upwards over time as an auto-enrolled person, and the contributions now are, if you like, by law, have to be at least 8% overall, and in many cases employers, I think, are putting in more than their statutory minimum, then over time the chances of breaching the MPAA for somebody who has flexibly accessed a pension fund can only increase. And there's always that worry then that suddenly a brown envelope lands on the doormat with a tax demand in it, because somebody's done something that they didn't realise they'd done. And they've done it because the law says, auto-enrollment, which is a brilliant concept and has been incredibly successful. It's great for most people. The worst case scenario is they have to opt out of the scheme because they're worried about breaching the MPAA, and then they lose that ongoing employer contribution as well.
It is worth saying, isn't it, that in this time of frozen allowances, frozen lifetime allowances, frozen personal allowances, and wage rises, that these are issues that are going to affect more and more people over the coming years. They're not niche issues, and it's something we all need to be aware of.
Well, and again, something I've personally been calling for quite a few years now is one way to stop the problem is scrapping the MPAA altogether. But I sort of feel that's probably not going to happen anytime soon.
It would feel against
because,
the tide, against the current tide of policy.
Yes.
Tax relief is one of the biggest benefits of pension contributions. And it's where you receive tax relief at your marginal income tax rate, whether that's basic or higher or additional. Do you foresee any changes to tax relief in the upcoming budget, knowing as you do all the previous iterations of tax relief and what's happened over the years?
Given how much has been spent on the pandemic, and clearly that's a curveball that nobody was anticipating even 3 tax years ago, it's got to be in the firing line. I can't believe that it's not being addressed or looked at within the Treasury, simply because of how much it costs them on a yearly basis. So I know for a fact if I didn't say anything now, something would happen after years of saying it's definitely going to change this year, and then lo and behold, nothing happens. So we'll have to wait and see.
Hedge your bets.
Yes.
And of course, there was going back to allowances, talk that in addition to freezing the lifetime allowance, there could be further cuts to it, perhaps 900 or even 800,000 pounds.
And I mean, when you think of that, and whether or not there was a bit of kite flying going on in the summer with stories like that circulating, but again, we were talking about the impact of the freezing of the allowance for 5 tax years, but reducing it down to 900 or 800,000 pounds. Yes, in theory, it's still a large figure, but that would seriously impact a number of people's retirement planning plans, and what it would do would then increase the excess amount of tax charges to the Treasury. So you think about where we were in 2006, starting with 1.5 million, and then we're looking at nearly a halving of it. 15 years later, it almost seems unbelievable in a way.
Well, perhaps because people don't actually understand how these allowances affect them until they reach that point, and then they're affected. So it's difficult for people to get angry until they're in a situation where it may affect them. It's worth mentioning again that with the lifetime allowance, it does capture investment growth, whereas the annual allowance is on contributions rather than investment growth. And of course, that actually does bring us on to something else that has been suggested this week, which is that the government wants to encourage pension funds to invest in infrastructure and building back better after the pandemic, and actually removing the fee cap on pensions. But of course, if it has the desired effect of improving investment returns for pension members, that's also going to bring more people over the lifetime allowance, something that hasn't really been touched on yet.
That's true, Becky, and I think there's been a great focus over the last couple of years or so on value for money, whether there should be a reduction in the current charge cap, particularly within workplace pension schemes, or with this levelling up agenda in mind, and maybe a focus on more illiquid long-term investments like building up the infrastructure across the UK, whether there could be some sort of dilution of the charge cap within pension schemes to allow the people who are investing the money to focus on these more illiquid investments rather than having all the money in assets which allow daily pricing, which certainly seems to be the current way. So it's something I know government bodies like the DWP do keep coming back to, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But I think with anything to do with charges, particularly with defined contribution schemes, I suppose the best situation would be to keep those charges as low as possible, because that then means there's more money in the pot to grow over time for people's ultimate retirement. But if the lifetime allowance continues to fall and fall, then you're right, it's going to just drag more people into that excess tax charge net.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, any higher charges have to be justified by the higher returns ultimately.
Well, agreed, yes. And I suppose there is a degree of expectation that these long-term illiquid infrastructure projects would deliver very reasonable returns over time. So it's a balance, isn't it? Ultimately, it's a balance of the internal charging structure of a pension against the potential long-term returns. And at the end of the day, pensions are long-term savings vehicles. And I think the only defence potentially against the excess tax charge, which we did touch on briefly before, are the protections that are available against a lifetime allowance. Now, I could, and I know I'm not going to, don't worry, but I could spend an hour talking about all the different protections because there are so many of them now. But the idea is that if you qualify for a protection, and they've been around since 2006, the aim of the game is to try and give you a bespoke lifetime allowance that is better or higher than the prevailing lifetime allowance or standard lifetime allowance, to again try and help reduce or hopefully eliminate any excess tax charge.
How would you know if you had a protection?
You are told by HMRC. Now, back in the early days, just after A Day, you had to apply on paper, and you got a certificate through the post saying congratulations, you've got enhanced. It didn't say congratulations, but it said either enhanced protection or primary protection or both. And then again, with the reduction in the lifetime allowance from 2012 onwards, there were then additional forms of protection came about: fixed protection and individual protection, initially paper-based. Now it can all be done online, and you would be able to go online and you would see confirmation there of the protection or protections that you have. And with certain protections, you've got to be careful not to do certain things, or else you'll lose it. And once you've lost it, there's no getting it back again.
Notwithstanding all of these changes, freezings, tax charges, and complicated elements like protection and how to preserve your protections, pensions remain the best long-term saving and investment vehicle. And indeed, actually, that was borne out in the survey too. So 2/3 of people see their pension as their ultimate source of retirement income. And long may that continue. But of course, it's a fine balance, isn't it, between generating revenue and keeping people interested in their pensions.
And I think for the younger people as well, retirement as a concept is so many years away into the future. You can fully understand why they're worried about whether they will even get a state pension, full stop. So it's great that we have things like auto enrollment now, where people and millions of people have benefited from this, auto enrolled into a workplace pension scheme with a good employer contribution as well as their own. The sooner they start, the more the pot has the greater chance to grow over time with investment returns, and hopefully give them a meaningful sum at the end of the day to turn into an income when they're no longer working.
James, thanks so much again. And
thank you.
Look forward to seeing you next month for the next Pensions Unpacked.
Right.
Please like and subscribe, and see you next time. Thank you very much.